When I look at our history, I realize that our history is not negotiable. It's not defined by slavery. It is a profound history, and we need to teach it in honesty. Hello, everyone. Hello. How are you doing today? I wanted you all to join us tonight. This is something that I wasn't able to be on yesterday, so I'm on here tonight with you guys because I really wanted to be able to get on. Tonight, we're going to hit a topic that has really kind of popped up this week, and I had to do a really quick interface on it. We're going to take a quick look at something really fast as I start this. Something that I have actually been considering and working on lately as we get ready to begin the program. I'm going to add it. Here it is. You don't have to go through it meticulously right now. When you go back and look at it, you can take the time to go do that. But it is a issue that I'm looking at on how we process what we do with our information. If you take a quick look at the model that you see, some of you have seen it because I kind of theoretically share some of this stuff on other social media. But I've been developing around a question, and it's been bothering me, the way that we process our information for years. Why can't people receive information about the same event, the same history, the same culture, the same phenomenon, the same culture construct, the same completely different understandings of what is happening? And that is what this kind of touches on to. It's not complete, so I'm not really worried about sharing it. This is just theoretically me throwing it out there and using a signals background basis. So I'm giving you that kind of as the groundwork of what we're going to talk about tonight. I am Eddie Phillips, and I'm a strategic public historian and a longtime studier of history. I'm approaching the problems using something from an analytical background and how we look at things. That is something that I believe that we need to do. We need to look at things in a system-based, let's not say systemically, but in a system-based understanding. Now, when you look at what we're going to talk about tonight, the Nolan Wells, we're going to touch on some of the pundits that are out there talking about this and competing claims surrounding different cases. We're going to talk about the Tasia Fortune, a 29-year-old Black woman who was found hanged in Mississippi. And in each case, we have information, but we also have an incomplete information sampling, filtering, amplification, noise, question and about sources, and people reaching different conclusions because they're taking in different inputs. So tonight we're going to test something. How does alleged become guilty? How can you be alleged and then automatically be assumed to be guilty? When does association become evidence? When does correlation get mistaken for causation? And when Black Americans recognize something that looks disturbingly familiar from our history, from our history of violence and racial violence, how do we use that history without allowing the resemblance itself as being proof? In other words, how can we look at that and just say, oh, because it resembles that is the proof? I'm not going to break down that entire model for you right now, but I want you to consider that model when you go back and pause and look, take a look at it as we go over what we're doing. If you're new to the Erudition Network, I'm going to ask you to subscribe, like the live, Share it with somebody who likes going deeper into history beyond headlines and pundits. But stay with me, because before we apply this test to what's happening right now, I have to lay out how we got here and the layers of mistrust. It built kind of where we've gone for the last couple episodes that we've been able to do. And then we're going to do something harder. We're going to apply that same evidentiary standard to everybody, including ourselves. So let's begin first with a very, very, very reasonable question. How can somebody become guilty before we even know what happened? Now, you may say, well, Eddie, that's because people jump to presumption, and presumption is a part of it. But I want you to think a little bit deeper, right? How can somebody become guilty before we know what happened? Before we even know, we seem to, in this country, automatically place guilt. How do you know somebody is guilty? Is the question. I'm not asking when you become suspicious of somebody. Suspicion simply means something has given you a reason to consider the possibility that a person may have been involved in something. I'm not asking when police decide somebody seems to be guilty or seems to be someone that they should question or interview. No, I'm not asking that. I mean something more specific. At what point can we responsibly move from saying this person may have done something to saying this person did it? What happens between those two statements? What evidence are we looking at? What's moved into there? What assumptions did we bring with us? I think we have to establish that first, because tonight we're going to move through Black history, psychology, statistics, law, criminology. You know how we do it here. But none of those disciplines helps us if we enter discussion having already decided that the evidence means guilt. History can tell us what has happened, what happened before, what occurred. Psychology can help us understand how people process that information. Statistics can help us identify relationships and measure those patterns. Law gives us the standard for moving from suspicion to what is actually adjudicated or judged guilt. But none of them independently gives us the permission to skip the process of establishing what happened in a particular case. Imagine a woman is found dead. Police learn that she argued with a man sometime before her death. Investigators interview him. And during that investigation, suppose they discover he illegally possessed a firearm or he broke some other law that allowed him to be arrested on that particular offense. Now ask yourself about what you know, not what you suspect. What do you know? You know there was a reportedly that they had an argument. He actually told you that they had an argument. You know investigators considered him relevant enough to interview him because he had a relationship with the victim. If the firearm information is established, you know there may be evidence of a separate offense or his propensity to break the law. Every one of those facts must become important, but none of them individually asks the question that brought the investigators there in the first place. What caused this woman's death? And did this particular man actually cause it? This is where something happens that many of us learn in statistics, because it's something we have to consider. It's much more than an academic phrase. It's much more than just a phrase. Correlation is not causation. Correlation means two things are associated in some observable or measurable way. Causation means that one thing actually contributes to producing another. If ice cream sales rise during the same months that drowning deaths rise, there is a relationship in the data, right? Possibly. But we should make you can make a serious mistake if we conclude that eating ice cream caused drowning, right? If there's no anything that aligns that. Think about the weather we're experiencing. More people buy ice cream and more people enter pools, lakes, and oceans when it's really, really hot. Statistics call something like that a confounding variable, which simply means that another factor is influencing the relationship we are examining. So because people eat ice cream because it's hot and they get in the pool because it's hot, there's a correlation with things being hot. But that doesn't mean one causes the other. Move that same reasoning into an investigation and suddenly the stakes are much more higher. An argument can matter. Proximity can matter. A lie can matter. A weapon can matter. Prior behavior may have something that can actually contribute. But what does each fact actually establish? If someone lies about where he was, investigators should absolutely ask why. But the existence of a lie does not automatically tell us something important about that person or lead investigators toward actual evidence that says that person did or committed a crime of murder or whatever. The causal connection still has to be demonstrated. That is where criminal investigation and scientific reasoning have something important. That's why you have to look at it. They can have some things important and in common. Investigators can develop a hypothesis, which is simply a proposed explanation that can be tested against the actual evidence. If the hypothesis is that a person A caused a death, and a good investigator should look at that, but cannot just say with consistency that they actually did it, right? They have to look at the information that makes person A actually seem to be guilty. We need to know whether the timeline works, rather physical evidence supports what we're talking about, and rather another explanation can account for the evidence being for or against. Those things have to be considered. Scientists sometimes call us doing things like that falsification. When we add things in that we shouldn't, which means deliberately asking what evidence could show your proposed explanation is wrong. That is important because if every possible piece of evidence or what you have can somehow be interpreted as something supporting your theory, then you are no longer really testing the theory. You're falsifying what it is that you're actually working on. And too often, this happens in our society. Too often, this is happening in our public debate. We falsify what it is that we're actually looking at. And the legal system tries to account for that uncertainty by establishing different evidentiary thresholds. Probable cause, which we all know, when the police can be able to pull you over because they assume by a behavior or something that shows that maybe you are involved in something, they have a probable cause to pull you over. Facts and circumstances to reasonably believe that you may have been a part of whatever the situation was or crime. But beyond a reasonable doubt is a much more higher standard required before a criminal conviction. It does not mean beyond every imaginable doubt. And that's where we get it wrong. It means that the prosecution must establish beyond what can be argued, guilt strongly enough that a reasonable doubt about guilt does not remain. If there is blood, if there is wounds on you, if there is video, things like that, beyond a reasonable doubt. But here's where the problem becomes more interesting. If we created all of these evidentiary distinctions because uncertainty matters, why are human beings so willing to collapse them? Why are we so willing to say somebody is guilty when something is alleged? Psychology gives us part of the answer. One mechanism is confirmation bias, and we've talked about that many times before. The tendency to notice or interpret information in ways that support something we already believe, our biases. Another is the need for cognitive closure, which describes our desire for a definite answer when uncertainty becomes uncomfortable. We need that cognitive closure. And neither means people are stupid. In fact, intelligent people can be exceptionally good at constructing sophisticated explanations and feeding these theories in their head and creating conspiracy theories. But is it believable? And that word matters. Believable matters. Why does one accusation feel immediately believable while others feel unlikely? Why can two people hear exactly the same incomplete information and come away with two different levels of certainty? At what point are we no longer dealing only with what happened in the individual case? We have to ask what each part builds. Communities teach us, schools teach us, churches teach us, the politics and the rhetoric around us teach us, pundits teach us, news organizations teach us, what we see in our movies and what we hear on our radios teach us, personal experience inform us. Sociology helps us examine how all of those individual belief interactions create our expectations. A stereotype can therefore, it can become more consequential than one person's prejudice, because once repeated through enough parts of society, through all of those things we talked about, it can begin influencing what behavior we actually start to do. Suppose a society begins with a belief that a particular population is unusually criminal. The expectation may influence where surveillance is concentrated, which behaviors receive attention, who's going to get stopped, what type of encounter, what is the strength of the encounter. And then all of that are put into records of data. Researchers, politicians, journalists, commentators later point to those data sets as evidence about the population. If those numbers then justify additional surveillance and causality, the output of the system has begun influencing what the system does not. Systems researchers call what we just talked about, it's a feedback loop. It occurs when something produced by a system returns as an input and affects future behavior. And it does it within the same systems architecture. Now, I want to be very precise. The existence of that possibility does not prove that every racial disparity in arrest statistics were created by discriminatory policies. Not saying that. That would be another casual claim. And that's another way of me talking about causality. And we would need evidence to establish that. The point is that once the method used to collect information can affect the information collected, we have to understand that the measurement process before deciding what the numbers mean. Consider that equation that I gave you at the beginning. Consider an arrest statistic. If somebody tells me that a particular racial population accounts for a certain percentage of arrests, what have I actually learned? I've learned something about recorded arrests. Before I convert that number, however, into a statement about inherent criminal behavior, I would need more information. That's why things like Officer Tatum and others and other pundits you out here is dangerous. How large is the population being measured? What ages are represented? What offenses are we including? What police were deployed? Which offenses are most likely to be detected through direct police contact, and which depend upon somebody reporting them. Those are all things that have to be included. Even something as basic as a denominator matters. A denominator is simply the total population against what we compare the number we are counting, what we're looking at. What is your denominator? And too often, what we're finding is people aren't even looking at the denominator. And even though we're taught this in math and statistics, and we should know this, a lot of us, too many of us, don't consider it. We don't consider it. And that's problematic. 10 arrests among 100 people do not describe the same rate as 10 arrests among 100,000 people. And notice what happens when we base investigation on this. We start with the individual accusation, but the question has pushed us into psychology, statistics, policing, law, and social systems, because each one helps explain a different part of how certainty gets constructed. And the uncomfortable possibility is that the statistics we later use to confirm what we believe about a population can sometimes emerge from institutions already influenced or biased by beliefs about that population. This is something that my wife actually often talks about, and her belief about why she doesn't trust statistics. And it's really not the issue of the statistics, it's the processing of it. How we process what we do. What happens when race enters that process? By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Black Americans were not encountering accusations inside a society that had formed no previous ideas about Black criminality. In other words, they looked at slaves and what it came before, and they'd already criminalized you and already said that you needed tutelage and that you were cognitively declinant and that you are going to need help. America has been exposed to political rhetoric, newspapers, reporting, movies, popular literature, race theology. And what was presented as scientific scholarship, all of those things claimed about Black intelligence as being subprime. They negatively talked about our intelligence, our sexuality, our morality, our criminal behavior. One of the sources we are using tonight gives us an unusually clear opportunity to examine how that reasoning worked. In 1915, physician and United States United States Army Medical Corps Major Robert Wilson Shufelt, who was respected, published America's Greatest Problem, the Negro. What makes Shufelt useful for our investigation idea is not simply that he expressed racial ideas. There were plenty of people doing that. What matters is how he presented those ideas as knowledge and fact. His title page surrounds him with scientific credentials, and people, they loved him as a professional and gave him professional affiliations and told him that he was a genius. And in the book, he invokes anatomy, physiology, anthropology, ethnology, psychology, medicine, and on and on and on, and evolutionary evidence to create a conclusion about Black people. And if you think about the difference that presentation makes, if someone tells you, I dislike Black people and I think they are dangerous, you immediately recognize that that's an opinion and they're probably prejudiced. But what happens when the same conclusion arrives wearing the language of medicine, biology, and science? Now the listener may believe he is not hearing prejudice at all. He or she is going to start to believe he's hearing measurement, validation. Shufelt even insisted that he didn't possess prejudice against Black people. He was saying that he was simply reporting what he had found and seen. And what's important to our question tonight, he argues that lynching will continue as long as Black people remain in the United States because he believed Black people could not escape what he regarded as their racial criminal instincts. I don't want us merely shaking our heads at how racist that sounds. I don't want us to say, oh, well, he was just a racist. I remember years ago, a guy told me, well, why you read these racist books? Why? You need to understand what was put out as science. He moved the proposed cause of individual behavior into a racial scientific cause. And once you accept that premise, the next accusation against a Black individual does not arrive alone. It arrives with causation. Because you say, of course, this is believable. This is what these people do. This is what it shows. Probability gives us useful language here. A prior. In statistics, a prior probability refers to what we think is likely happening before evaluation of new evidence. We use informal priors constantly. If somebody tells you that Colorado received snow in January, you probably need less convincing than if that person tells you Colorado received snow in July, because you know snow is going to fall in January. So what happens when a society creates a racial prior? What happens when generations of political rhetoric, science, and everything we talked about creates that prior? What questions are being presented then? It's not what every accused Black person did or if they were innocent. It's not even saying that. I'm sure there's always going to be someone guilty regardless of race or whatever. But when you create a prior that paints with a broad brush over everyone, it becomes dangerous. And then we have the historical responsible question. Did Blackness itself become information in the minds of Americans evaluating accusation and guilt? Because Schufelt shows us racial theory is capable of producing that expectation. We have records from people who believe Black criminality was racial, built in the blood, as one of the presidents recently said. We have records that Black journalists and scholars who challenged those claims because they knew that they were prejudicial and racial. We have newspapers, we have criminal statistics. So it's not me making this up. And what that means is that we don't have to guess. We don't have to guess. And it also leads us to another question. What happened when these ideas about Blackness moved beyond books and theories and entered the institutions responsible for deciding who looked suspicious? The police, the law. When did these accusations seem believable? How were these accusations used in investigation? And then, because we added a racial connection to it, who received the benefit of the doubt? Those are questions that arise from that type of thought. What happens when Blackness itself becomes part of the evidence? Did Blackness itself become information in the minds of Americans evaluating an accusation? Because if it did, we're dealing with something more complicated than individual prejudice. We are dealing with a historical system in which the identity of the accused could affect how evidence was interpreted before guilt had actually even been established. But we cannot prove that by pointing at Schufelt by itself and saying, he's a racist writer. Therefore, this is how, that's how America worked. There's just racists here. We need to know rather the reasoning appears elsewhere, rather it entered institutions, rather it's a competing voice that's out here in the noise, as I showed you with the equation I gave you earlier. Has it been recognized over time? To understand that, we have to go backward before we go forward. That's why I'm laying this groundwork for you for the problem, because the presumption did not suddenly appear during the lynching era. American law had already spent generations assigning different legal meaning to Black status. Under slavery, that distinction was explicit. Enslaved people were human beings living with a legal system that simultaneously treated them as property and restricted the legal capacities available to them to get out of that slavery. That meant that their movement could be regulated. Their testimony could be restricted or excluded. Their family relationships lacked many of the protections available to citizens, particularly whites. Violence committed against them did not necessarily receive the same legal treatment as violence against white people. For over 200 years of this country's established history, and even beyond that. None of that matters. None of that matters if you blow it off and say that they're just criminals. But I would counter and say none of that means every jurisdiction should have operated that way. And I'm sure some of them didn't. George Washington had a slave who, when he was president, who escaped while he was in Philadelphia, which was where the original White House was, while George Washington was violating the law. The law said that a slave that was in Philadelphia, after 6 months, could petition for freedom. So George Washington, the president of the United States, cycled his slaves out. We have documented proof of that in letters that he wrote to his lawyer and to his legal representation. American legal institutions had long experience assigning different evidentiary and legal weight to people according to racial status. And when you think about what that does to people and what that does to the meaning of credibility. If the legal system says one person's testimony is admissible and another person is not because of racial status, the system is doing more than expressing prejudice. It's making a decision about who is capable of producing legally recognized knowledge, information, or wisdom. And we see that today. Still today. And that is an epistemological, which is what the word I told you all last week, decision. Epistemology simply means the study of knowledge, how we know something, what counts as evidence, and why we consider one source more credible than another. And America has an epistemological problem, and it has had it since even before its inception. Whose version of reality is historically or even currently allowed to count? Think about that as you look at these pundits putting out information over the last few weeks and the trials in the case of Nolan, Wells, and others. Think about that. What becomes particularly important about all of that is where it comes from and how it has been established. And now it's just something that we just, as we said earlier, it's a part of our public accepted knowledge. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery and involuntary servitude, except as punishment for crime after a conviction. And that exception does not by itself prove that post-war criminal law was created simply to recreate slavery. But when we look at the other parts of it that go into what was being done, charging people with vagrancy and simple crimes in order to put them in jail. Because see, once slavery was prohibited, but forced labor remain constitutionally permissible as long as you are seen as a criminal, then the question becomes, who then do we define as a criminal? Southern states even enacted laws commonly grouped under the terms black codes. Those laws vary considerably, so we got to be careful about how we put them. But broadly, however, they restricted black freedom through labor regulations, vagrancy laws, apprenticeship provisions, movement restrictions, and other measurable things designed specifically to control blacks. A vagrancy law generally criminalized being without recognized employment. You didn't have a job. You didn't have income. And any other legally acceptable means of supporting yourself. So if you were out of a job, if you were not laboring as a black person, you were a vagrant. Let's not make it look this as if you were laying out on the ground homeless. No, if you didn't have a job, you were a vagrant, no matter where you stayed. Now think about that from a system's perspective. A person that's just emerged from slavery, they don't have nothing. Actually, after they didn't have land, they didn't have a place to go to. They didn't know where they had no accumulated wealth. They had no political power. They had no cultural, local power. They had no equal access to employment. And the economic conditions surrounding that person were horrible, and they could increase the likelihood of them actually being seen as a criminal because they were a vagrant. And once classified as a criminal offender, legal penalties can then push that person into another coercive system because now he's a repeat offender. So where's the cause? If blackness becomes criminality, what are we saying? Are we saying that every black person back then, because they had no job, they were criminals? That's what we're saying. That's what the laws were saying. So then when you look at the statistics of that time, see how they could be slewed. It's important why correlation and causation matter historically. If I look only at the final criminal record, I see people convicted of an offense. If I examine the system that produced the record, I can discover that the definition of the offense and how it was brought about could be dubious. Same thing when we put people in convict leasing, a system where government leased incarcerated black people, usually, most often, to private businesses. And it was slavery under another name. And they could be in that system for years, decades, their life. Once incarcerated labor systems produce revenue and reduce labor costs, they become desirous. And everyone seems to be criminalized in order to feed the system. It becomes incentivized. And an incentive is simply, for those who don't know, something that makes a particular action more beneficial, something that we desire. Incentives don't prove motive, but they can push people to do things. System analysis requires us to look at incentives because institutions can produce patterns without every participant sharing exactly the same personal motivation. One official may be motivated by racial ideology. Another may believe he's enforcing the law neutrally. Another may care about labor. Another may care about political control. All of these are incentives and that motivate or are motivated by incentives. The motives can differ while the actions still feed the same institutional outcome. And that creates a problem of a pattern. When people hear pattern, they sometimes assume we mean a secret coordinated plan. No. It's not a secret coordinated plan. Systems don't necessarily work that way. A pattern can emerge from interacting rules, right? Incentives, beliefs, motives, And those things push the pattern. That is what social scientists sometimes describe as an emergent outcome, right? Which is produced by the interaction of parts of a system, even when no single participant designed the entire system result, but they all play into each other. That matters. That matters. Now, if we return back to the literature that we're going to discuss tonight, I have to talk about a man named Charles Carroll. Charles Carroll wrote the book, The Negro Beast, or In the Image of God. He produced it and published it in 1900. And it represents an extreme attempt to remove Black people from the category of equal humanity altogether. Carroll used biblical interpretation, anatomical claims, cranial measurements, brain weights, comparisons with apes, and the language of scientific observation and evolution to argue that Black people were fundamentally different from white people. And I'm not using Carroll simply as shocking language. Shock is not analysis. I'm using him to showcase to you something. I want you to ask instead, what kind of argument was he constructing with all of that? Carroll took observations and measurements, and then he made increasingly large inferences from them. And inference is the conclusion that you come to, right? That a conclusion drawn from evidence rather than something directly observed. Oh, I saw it, so that must be true. Inference is essential to reasoning. I don't blow it away. We use it constantly. But the problem is, rather, the evidence actually supports the size of the conclusion that you're drawing. Craniology was proven to be pseudoscience. A skull measurement is a measurement. A brain weight is a measurement. Carroll used those to suggest something by his inference, not the actual scientific validated facts. And that is why pseudoscience can be very persuasive to people. Pseudoscience, I like to try to define everything that I say to those who may have never heard it. Pseudoscience is the appearance of language of science without meeting the methodical nature of science. What you have to do in using the scientific process. It may use numbers. It may use instruments. It may cite authorities. It may even contain some accurate observations of what it measures. But the failure can occur in sampling, measurement, interpretation, bias, assumptions, and the inability to actually test the claim factually. Carroll then moved beyond anatomy into theology. He attempted to use the Bible as an interpretation to argue that Black people weren't fully human and that they were beasts of the field. He made all of these things based on things that he knew people could accept, other than making a racist, bigoted claim. If the scientist and the theologian begin with the same racial assumption, agreement between them may now represent facts to others. And that's a crucial distinction between repeating something and something being factual. If medicine says it, if anthropology says it, if the Bible says it, if the newspaper says it, if all of these things are putting out false equivalences, people are going to start to listen to that. And that is where theology has to be taken seriously. We can't just blow theology up. Well, everybody's not in Christian faith or faith-based. He was making a theological claim about human nature, about Christian theology, and playing into the moral frame of people who may not follow a scientific background. Those interpretations matter because Black churches did not simply encounter racial violence as willy-nilly things. Ministers and congregations had to wrestle with a society in which Christianity itself had been weaponized and invoked as a racial hierarchical system. We're not going to settle that theological argument or go into that tonight, but I want you to consider Carroll and how he approached it, just as how Schufelt approached it. Carroll gives us something else that moves us to tonight's central issue. In discussing crime, he cites arrest and crime figures involving Black residents and then uses those figures to make broader claims about their mindset, their bodies, and their structure and their racial character. He condemns Black people who defended accused Black defendants, and he attacks whites who did the same thing, interpreting that that defense, right, is evidence that even supposedly respectable people sympathize with criminality. He made them feel bad about supporting Blacks. How does the accused escape logic like that? This is what makes ideological systems difficult to deal with. Evidence supporting a belief confirms it. People start to believe based on what they think is the evidence. And then we get into another man, Thomas Dixon, the one who wrote The Klansman that became Birth of a Nation of film. Dixon did not primarily operate through anatomical measurements. His enormous influence came through narrative. He told stories about Black people. As I said, he wrote The Klansman. He talked about Black sexuality, Black people as criminals and savages. And if you look at how all of that system comes together, the law can define particular Black behavior as criminal. Economic systems can benefit from criminal classification. Scientific writers can interpret criminal records as evidence, or should I say pseudoscience writers, of racial nature. Theological arguments can give racial hierarchy moral legitimacy. Literature, then, with Dixon, can provide a memorable character who embodies that supposed danger. And then newspapers and media can then report actual accusations to an audience already accepting the bias. No single part has to create the entire belief, as I said earlier. They all just got to come together. The historical claim we are investigating is narrower and more testable. American institutions and intellectual culture develop racial frameworks capable of affecting how accusations against Black people could become facts or convictions before they were ever tried. And we have evidence throughout that this existed. We know that it existed. What happens when somebody takes the allegation that a society has been repeating, separates accusation from evidence, starts counting the cases, and asks whether numbers actually support the story? What happens when we do that? Well, when you do something like that, that takes us into Ida B. Wells and what I talked to you all about last week, because that's exactly what Ida B. Wells did. Ida understood that there was a need. There was a need to go in and count those numbers. She didn't do that simply because she felt that she needed to prove, that all these people were innocent. She dealt that because that's the actual process that needs to happen in order for us to reach a actual reasonable conclusion. We have seen attempts in what I just talked about, right, to place Black criminality inside biology, physiology, theology, economics, and we see it even today. Every day, I'm approached with something where someone has put something out that does that. And then you have to ask a very hard question. right? Let's ask two questions. What did Ida B. Wells find when she actually checked? Let's ask that question. And then let's ask a sub question. Were the accusations being used to explain racial violence actually supported by the evidence? That's what we're going to talk about, try to get through right now really quickly. Because that's where Ida B. Wells, to me, becomes so important in Black history and in how we look at this country. And I try to be very careful with Ida B. Wells, because she has become such a symbolic, iconic figure that sometimes we flatten what made her actually intellectually important. We remember her courage and going to talk about these lynchings. We remember her writings, but she investigated the claims being used to justify illegal actions, and that distinction matters. And she had reason to do so personally. I've done an episode before where I talked about how three Black businessmen in Memphis that Ida was friends with, Thomas Moss, Calvin McDowell, and Henry Stewart. And I won't get into the whole grocery store story too much. But basically, these men were accused of violating the law because they were defending a very popular Black store in Memphis. And whites, while they were in jail, pulled these men out of their jail and dragged them to the railroad depot and killed them, shot them to death, murdered them. Ida, being a friend of it, of Moss, she decried how this was evil mob violence because the newspaper was actually invited to be there to watch these killings, and they described it very, very systematically on how it happened because they were there. This inspired Ida, and in Southern Horrors, she directly challenged the claim that lynching was primarily a response to Black men raping white women or breaking the law. But that claim predominantly raping white women. She wanted to make people understand that this was wrong. There was not a minor disagreement about statistics. The rape accusations occupied an extraordinarily large and powerful place in racial imagination of the time because it combines race, sex, gender, what people were taught to believe, as we talked about earlier, in criminality. And the accused Black man could be transferred from a person whose guilt needed to be established to someone who was just naturally guilty and whom the community supposedly needed protection from by any means necessary. Wells asked a question that the emotional power of the accusation often discouraged a lot of people from asking. What actually happened? Did this person actually rape someone? And that may sound ordinary to us, but in the context in which Wells was asking, it was explosive. She began examining cases rather than treating the public explanation as the conclusion. And when we move from Southern Horrors into the Red Record, we can see something especially important in her work. Wells categorized lynching according to the offenses that were being attributed to the victims. But look carefully when you read that at the language preserved in those categories. We find murder, but also alleged murder. We find rape, but more often alleged rape. Suspicion of rape, suspicion of murder, suspicion and alleged. We find those words over and over and over again, suspected of robbery. And then we have unknown offenses. Now stop. Think about what those categories reveal. The punishment is not alleged. The person is dead. They lynched them. They killed them. But in most cases, the offense used to explain the killing remained alleged, suspected, or unknown. So if you consider everything we talked about earlier, that creates an evidentiary problem that is central to what we're talking about. If the accused person is killed before a trial establishes guilt, then the allegation can become both the justification for the punishment and afterward the explanation for why the punishment supposedly occurred. The death eliminates the opportunity for the person to ever be adjudicated, ever to be found innocent. How do you calculate guilt under those circumstances? You can't simply count the allegation as though it were a conviction, because it never was. But statistics for American criminality, black criminality, often does. And that is where statistics become more than numbers on a page. Before you can count something, you have to decide what category it belongs in. That's why we call it classification. And if we don't, then we have a methodological problem. Our method is corrupt. We're not putting the proper variables in. We're not categorizing things correctly. Imagine 100 cases. Suppose 20 people were convicted of an offense. 20 were formally accused but never tried. 20 were merely suspected. 20 were killed for unrelated accusations. And 20 had no identifiable accusation at all. If I label all of those, right? Do you start to see how classification matters? This is why definitions matter. When we use historical statistics, historical information, numbers can look objective while concealing those racist decisions that were actually counted or put into those numbers. And Ida B. Wells understood that problem intuitively. And she wasn't using the language of modern statistical methodology. She just understood we need to understand the why. What happened? Her work repeatedly distinguishes between the public claim and the underlying circumstances. That is one reason the red record matters so much. And if you have not gotten that, you need to go out and get that book. There are free copies online. There's no reason for you not to go out and read Ida's work. And it's not that long. She was not merely accumulating bodies. She was interrogating the explanation attached to those bodies. Ida B. Wells was an anti-lynching activist. She had a position. She was trying to expose an injustice. Does that mean that we dismiss her numbers because she may have had that predilection or that bias for what she was doing? No, but neither should we accept them merely because we agree with her moral position. If our argument tonight is about evidentiary discipline, then Wells has to survive evidentiary discipline too. We have to look at her work and also talk about her bias, because I know some people are going to say that. So we can test her. Go look at a book by James Elbert Cutler. We talked a little bit about this last week. He becomes extremely useful because Cutler, he published Lynch Law. He was a PhD. Lynch Law was an investigation in the history of lynching in the United States in 1905 when he wrote it. His project approached lynching as a broader social and historical phenomenon rather than simply reproducing what Ida B. Wells said. And it gives us an opportunity to compare researchers who did not occupy exactly the same intellectual position. Cutler's figures create a serious problem for the popular explanation Wells had been attacking, what she was going after. Looking at Black victims of the South from 1882 to 1903, Cutler concluded that his statistics could not show more than approximately 34% as having been lynched for rape, even when his category included attempted rape and alleged rape. That number needs context. It does not tell us that 34% were proven rapists. Cutler's grouping itself includes attempted and alleged rape. It does not tell us that the remaining victims were innocent or of every offense, and it does not mean sexual violence was unimportant or was just imaginary. What it does is it challenges a casual explanation that presented the protection of white women from Black sexual assault as though it explained lynching generally. If the proposed cause is supposed to explain the phenomenon, but the category accounts for only a minority of the recorded cases, even after allegations and attempts are included, then we have to look for additional causes. What else is happening? And that's how sociology, economics, politics, and psychology come back into the investigation, into what we're talking about, because lynching begins looking less like a single issue for a single cause and more like a form of social control capable of appearing under different accusations. Some people are accused of murder, assault, or sexual offense. Others of insulting whites, violating racial expectations and codes, economic competition, in the case of Moss and the People's Grocery, or offenses that seem astonishingly minor compared to the ones that are up above, such as vagrancy or just being in the wrong place at the wrong time. And that's why Thomas Moss and his death at the People's Grocery or Ida B. Wells' friend, becomes important. It becomes important. Moss, McDowell, and Stewart were not lynched because of allegations of rape. The People's Grocery existed within an economic and racial conflict in Memphis. A successful Black business was competing with a white business, and it was beating them. And after an altercation, the men were arrested, and then they were pulled out of their jail and they were murdered. And for Wells, that destabilized the explanation that she had been hearing about lynching, about the raping of white women and about the sexual assault. Because see, economics changed the casual model. Competition mattered, property mattered, Black economic independence mattered, political power mattered, racial hierarchy mattered. The accusation attached to a person may therefore tell us something about the immediate event, right? As we talked about earlier. Now we have to start putting in these other things, explaining the entire social mechanism that produced the punishment. And that's a crucial distinction. In casual analysis, we can have a proximate cause, an underlying structural condition. A proximate cause is the event closest to an outcome. A structural condition or a condition is a part of the larger environment that makes certain outcomes more likely or shapes how an event may unfold. If I were to make that more clear to you, imagine a fire. A spark may ignite it, but if the building is filled with gasoline, fumes, and other flammable things, understanding only the spark gives us an incomplete explanation of why the fire became a catastrophe and destroyed an entire community. And historical analysis works very much similarly. Analysis works that way. An accusation may trigger a mob, but why does that accusation produce catastrophic violence in one social environment and a criminal trial in another? Why does one accused person receive counsel, evidence, and everything that they need, whereas another one is pulled out, lynched, and cut apart and destroyed? That question takes us beyond individual prejudice. Cutler himself recognized that the importance of public sentiment. His analysis emphasized that lynching depended in part upon communal behavior, communal approval, tolerance, expectations. If the South is looking at you as criminal and they see the only way to deal with you is to kill you and murder you and burn you, now the psychology changes. We are no longer asking only whether one individual believes an accusation. We are asking how groups become certain together. That introduces social proof, the tendency to use the reactions of other people as information about what is true or appropriate. That groupthink. And once we fall into that, it could be dangerous. And there is another mechanism operating here too: moral disengagement. Psychologist Albert Bandura used that term. He used that term, came with that term, moral disengagement, to describe processes through which people distance themselves from ordinary moral restraints. And they justify the most barbaric behavior because of it. People can redefine harmful conduct as necessary, causal, and they portray victims as deserving what happened to them, no matter how barbaric or murderous or cruel that it is. And you have to think about an accusation like that, what it can do inside that process. If the accused person has already been transformed into a monster, a rapist, a savage, a threat to women, a threat to the community, a threat to the Southern way of life, however you frame it, the mob no longer experiences itself as murdering someone whose guilt has not been established. It can imagine itself protecting its society from someone whose guilt has already been proven and not even seen anymore as assumed. That doesn't excuse the violence, but it shows us how that works. And this is where theology quietly reenters the problem tonight. A lot of these communities identified themselves as Christians. People attended church. They even had church picnics during the lynchings. They read scripture, prayed, raised children. So the theological question is not simply, were they hypocrites? Now, that's too easy. The harder question is, what had to happen morally and psychologically for people who believe murder was sinful to redefine their extrajudicial killings at the level in which we know lynchings happened? What made them look beyond that person and no longer see a person, see a savage, see someone that deserved what they were getting? And I know this is a lot to unpack, but I need you to understand that this is where we are today. And this is why these things play such an important part in how we look at pundits. We don't just sit here and talk about the history with you on Erudition. I go painstakingly to try to add and to give you this polymetric idea of understanding how this works. It's not just about the rape. It's not just about the accusation. It's not just about the statistic. It's about identifying how all of those things played into where we are. And that's what makes this particular episode, in my opinion, important. Why can one accusation become more believable than the evidence? How does that happen? And this is why I wanted to touch on Ida B. Wells again, even though we talked a little bit about her last week. Why did the accusation of sexual violence and particularly the accusation of black men assaulting white women acquire such extraordinary power that asking whether the accusation was true itself, it could be blown off? And that question matters. That question matters. It also enters a human mind carrying meanings that were therefore being manipulated. And when those accusations arrive in a mind that's been manipulated, then those meanings now involve fear, sexuality, race, family, masculinity, femininity, and even the perceived protection of children or women. On both sides, do we see black children as criminals? Do we see them as violent offenders also? History shows us that we did. What made particular allegations so psychologically difficult to question? I'd understood that the accusation of rape occupied a special position in the minds of people who felt they were defending the Southern cause. That's why she called it Southern horrors. She challenged the claim that the mob violence represented a necessary response to black men sexually assaulting white women. But see, what made her challenge more so dangerous was not simply that she disputed it statistically, and it was proven by others who looked at it. Wells questioned the racial and sexual story underneath the statistics. She argued that some relationships publicly described as rape were consensual. And we know from diaries, records, and books that was absolutely true. But once found out, people took a backtrack. Not always the person who was in a relationship, families and others. So it was rape. The backlash against Ida's interpretation and understanding of that was severe. They destroyed her Memphis newspaper. They ran her out of Memphis under threat of life. Her challenge had crossed a boundary because she was not merely asking whether one accused man was guilty. She was asking the question whether the cultural explanation behind why you were murdering people and burning bodies and doing these things like that in itself was reliable. And then ask yourself, if she's simply asking you to prove cause, right? Why was the reaction so violent? To answer that, you have to understand something that psychologists term schema. A schema is a mental framework we use to organize information and interpret new experiences. Schemas are necessary. As most things that we talk about in psychology, they are necessary because that's how we process information. Without them, every experience would have to be understood from the beginning. So we establish a schema. When you enter a restaurant, you already possess a rough schema of what that restaurant is, what you could expect, what the service is going to be, what they have on the menu or whatever. The problem comes when a schema contains false assumptions. And it really is critical when it contains false assumptions about human groups. The new information can be interpreted through a framework that makes some explanations feel natural before they actually have been established. Thomas Dixon, that we talked about earlier, did this when you talk about the criminality and the violence of Blacks. He lets us see that the racial schema could be culturally reinforced through literature, through movies. He wrote The Klansman as a book. It was popular, and then it became a movie. The Birth of a Nation. The distinction between prevalence and salience is important. Prevalence asks how often something actually occurs. Salience refers to how noticeable, memorable, or psychologically prominent something is. An event can be statistically uncommon and still dominate public consciousness. If it is an emotionally intense enough situation, it can go beyond that, and it can be repeatedly discussed. 9/11 didn't happen every day, but it was such a horrible experience that it stays with us. This is where our perception of risk does not, that's one of the reasons why it does not always neatly fit into actual frequency. And why I gave you that equation earlier. Psychologists call one part of what I'm talking about availability heuristics. A heuristic is a mental shortcut that helps us make judgments quickly. We use it all the time. The availability of heuristics describes our tendency to establish how common or likely something is going to happen. And we can make decisions based on that. Politicians use it. Fiction dramatizes it. Communities retell stories. And then examples become cognitively available for all of us. And when a new allegation appears, the mind does not encounter it as an isolated event. But here's what we got to be very clear. The existence of a stereotype does not establish that a particular accusation is false. A white woman could be sexually assaulted by a Black man. That could actually happen. Wells never needed to prove that such crimes never occurred. That wasn't the point, because that would be both historically indefensible and irrelevant to the stronger argument. She was not trying to say that sexual assault didn't happen. The evidentiary question is rather the racial identity of the accused was being used to increase the perceived guilt and thus punishment of that person, and show you that this is a probability problem. And it is a probability problem as much as a racial one. Because if you suppose someone tells you that a member of Group A committed a particular offense or crime, and then gives you information about how often members of Group A supposedly commit that crime, which I saw Officer Tatum recently do on something, and him and others, they do the same thing. Even if the group statistics were perfectly accurate, it would not tell us whether the individual committed this particular act. Moving from information about a population to a conclusion about an individual without sufficient individual evidence or information risks what is often called ecological fallacy. An ecological fallacy occurs when we assume that a relationship observed at the group level can be necessarily described or put into a particular person within the group. And you have to be careful of that when you're sampling populations. Population patterns can help researchers understand population. They cannot substitute for evidence establishing individual guilt. And once fear enters the calculation, as we said earlier, then everything goes to hell. When people perceive threat, the body prepares for action. When you tell them that they're in danger, the body prepares to fight because they believe it's dangerous and they react in kind. And it helps us understand something about the crowds about these crowds who went out and harmed people and believed that blacks were criminals. It helps us to understand something about crowds that individual psychology alone cannot explain. A frightened individual can become part of a frightened community. People observe one another. They feed off of one another. Rumors move. Authority speaks. Newspapers publish lies. Someone claims to know what happened. Another person repeats that. We see it all the time online. The accusation then becomes more detailed as it travels, even when the additional details are wrong and can't be verified. And it becomes a nightmare. It is what we call an information cascade. An information cascade occurs when people begin making judgments partly on the basis of what previous people appear to believe and are providing to you. And it shapes where we are and what we're doing. Because once a community accepts an accusation, another psychological mechanism kicks in. Belief perseverance. Belief perseverance is the tendency for an established belief to survive even after the evidence and facts prove it wrong. People still believe that some people who were lynched deserve to be lynched in their communities. People still believe that the Southern cause for the Civil War was moral and of purpose to keep people in slavery. They don't correct their belief. It perseveres. Charles Carroll makes us especially see that, because when you reveal examples of his reasoning in the material that he put in the Negro, a beast or an image of God, he cites crime figures. He cites doctors and people and theologians, and he puts all this stuff in here, which is a belief that persevered over time. Didn't just start with Charles Carroll. Look at what that does to any possibility of disagreement. If the accused person, black person, is guilty by stereotype or their perceived communal confirmation, they're automatically guilty and they deserve whatever happens to them. It's not unfalsified. It's falsified and backed up with falsified evidence and falsified facts and schema and all of the things we talked about. And this is an important distinction that has to be made as we go forward, because it tells us why we are running into these problems today. I'm not giving you these historical writers and people for absolutely no reason. I'm not doing this episode tonight without a reason. I'm doing it because I want you to understand where this goes. Someone says something and it continues. And then we have to ask, when does the institution reporting guilt begin helping to create public certainty that guilt has already been established? Those things like our newspapers, back then, and our online groups. Because we have to understand, social media did not change the pattern. It just sped it up. Social media allow for us to pass theory, conspiracy theory, and everything further and further and further. Because what it did was it made the information boom easier to provide. A 5-year arrest becomes evidence to an actual crime. A 10-second clip becomes evidence of what actually happened. People are guilty just because of a rumor. People can jump in on the rumor and they can accuse you, people who have never even met you. And if our bias is applied to that, then we allow ourselves to be manipulated by it. Because then we add in our own biases, our fear. We add fear, death, sex, political identity, distrust of the police, distrust of black people, distrust of white people, distrust of conservative commentators, distrust of liberal commentators, and on and on and on. And those 30 seconds of video, those quick videos become our basis to tell us this is what really happened. The viewer is no longer simply a consumer at the end of the information chain. When you repost something, when you add a caption, when you clip a video, when you repeat a claim or tell somebody this is what happened, you become part of the information system, no matter whether it's right or wrong, whether it's a lie or not. You are part of the information participants of that system. And that we know none of us consider, we all do it. We click and share. The ethical responsibility is rarely discussed or even thought about. So when it comes to cases like Nolan Wells, the idea of putting out an information or being the first on the scoop, being the first one to interview friends and people with our own biases becomes what we want to put out. A scholar should be able to say the evidence I had yesterday supported this possibility. The evidence available today no longer supports it. A journalist should be able to do that. A police department should be able to do that. A historian should be able to do that. A commentator should be able to do that. And what we've worked for tonight is we should be able to do that, because now we have reached a point where the entire historical argument has to face the same test we have demanded from everybody else. I'm going to take these last few minutes to do that. We have identified mechanisms. We have identified historical precedent. We have documented reasons for Black mistrust. We have understood how racial assumptions can influence interpretation. We understand how digital systems can accelerate certainty. But none of that tells us what happened in a specific contemporary case. So now we have to stop talking about the pattern in the abstract, and we have to apply it to an examination. When we look at Nolan Wells, the Officer Tatum discourse that's out here, the Tasia fortune hanging that happened, and the current claims surrounding those cases, can we actually distinguish what is documented from what is alleged? Can we separate association from causation? Can we identify where evidence stops and interpretation begins? And perhaps maybe that's the most important question of the entire episode. Can we recognize that a historical pattern without forcing a modern cause or mold to fit it? Which could be our politics and everything that I mentioned earlier. That is a test that we have to perform. That was the purpose for this episode tonight, that I sat and I thought about. And that's the purpose for what I gave you, even with my equation earlier. How are we coming to different conclusions while receiving the same evidence? My wife has theories, I have theories, but at the end of it, We're suffering as a society from it. We're suffering as a society from it. And we've spent this evening showing the accusations can outrun the evidence. The racial expectations can influence what people find believable. That institutions can amplify uncertain information. So now I want to do something a little bit different. I want to do something that I think is necessary if we're going to call this an Erudition Network historical investigation. I want to put our own thesis on trial. Let's start with Nolan Xavier Wells, because this case gives us exactly the kind of uncertainty we have been talking about. There are things we know. Nolan was 18 years old. He traveled on a boat with friends to Horn Island in Mississippi on July 4th. He did not return with that group. His brother reported him missing, and his body was found in waters near Horn Island on July 6th. His family subsequently retained attorney Ben Crump and sought an independent investigation because they believe important questions remain unanswered from what the police had given them. Those are facts we can work with. Now watch how quickly facts began producing questions. Why did Nolan remain on the island? Did he choose to remain? Was there an altercation? What happened with his phone? What happened to him? What did his friends know? What did they know? Did they know he was missing? What did they know about why he was missing? What happened between his last confirmed interaction and the discovery of his body? These are legitimate questions. Everybody should be able to ask these questions. But a legitimate question is not a conclusion. The Jackson County Sheriff publicly said the friends returned without Nolan and that authorities understood that Nolan had chosen to stay on Horn Island. Nolan's family and his attorney raised concerns about contradictions and sought further investigation and asked more questions. The family's independent autopsy subsequently left both the cause and manner of death undetermined. That creates more questions. That word undetermined matters. It does not mean homicide. It does not mean accident. It does not mean suicide. It does not mean anyone did or did not do anything to it. It means available information had not been established, which explained the account of his death, which means that his parents were absolutely right in asking a question before the police just dismissed the case, because there is uncertainty. And uncertainty is not empty space that we are entitled to fill with whatever historical narrative we find most convincing. Now think about that. Think about why this particular case produced such an intense suspicion within portions of Black America. A young Black man goes on an island with friends and does not return. Most of the friends are white. His body later is recovered. Questions arise about the timeline. His family wants answers. Nobody can give them answers. The case occurs in Mississippi, a state carrying an enormous documented history of racial lynching, murder, and racial violence. We have just spent much of this episode examining why Black communities learned historically that official explanations were not always proof and most often deserve scrutiny. So is mistrust irrational? Absolutely not. But is mistrust evidence of homicide? No, no one's saying that. Those two propositions can exist simultaneously, right? The distinction between the distinction between those two things can work in correlation with each other. That distinction becomes especially important because the Nolan Wells story developed inside precisely the digital information system we were talking about, and the information and the bias systems that we were talking about. Claims circulated, interpretations of those videos circulated, social media circulated. Then let's introduce another variable. Officer Brandon Tatum is particularly interesting for our analysis because he is reporting it. Let me say this precisely. His reporting, right, eventually introduced another layer of competing claims. Tatum traveled to Mississippi, went to Horn Island, interviewed one of Nolan's friends. And when Nolan's friends disputed portions of the narrative circulating online, including claims about Nolan simply being abandoned on the island. Now, what do we do with that? We don't automatically believe Hudson because he says he was there. We don't automatically disbelieve him because he may have an interest in how the story is understood. We evaluate. We look at it. Was he present? Can parts of his account be independently corroborated? Does GPS data support portions of his timeline that he provided? Do videos support it? Do other witnesses support it? Does physical evidence contradict it or support it? Those are evidentiary questions that aren't being asked by pundits who get online. CBS obtained GPS data tracking the boat's movement that day, giving investigators and public another source capable of testing portions of the timeline. That is useful because human testimony and instrument-generated data are important in order for us to come to some evidentiary thought process of did a crime occur? Not if Nolan was killed by his friends, but did a crime occur? And that's an important distinction in casual reconstruction. A timeline constrains the possibilities of things. It makes you have to look at what actually happened. But it does not explain motives. And then we get to something that I think is even more revealing by Officer Tatum's discourse. Tatum later published additional allegations he said had been shared with him by multiple sources. But look at the qualification he placed on those claims. He explicitly stated that the information had been confirmed by law enforcement or independently verified by him and described the information as allegations. That's what he said. The qualification should control how we discuss the information. If the source himself says, I have not independently verified this, we cannot remove that uncertainty when we repeat it, right? We got to keep that uncertainty there. This is where information sometimes mutates into something that moves around the digital networks. The original speaker says, I have been told this, but I cannot verify that. A second person posts, Tatum is saying this. A third person says, we know this. And by the time the claim reaches the fourth or fifth person, the uncertainty has disappeared, even though no new evidence was added. And now we're all going off of what we thought was said. And it's not because Tatum necessarily caused it. The audience can remove the qualification themselves. But if the pundit starts with removing things, then that degradation happens even quicker. And let's understand the opposite can happen. Someone can dislike Tatum politically or distrust his interpretation on the case. And they can do the same thing going the other way. But in the end of all of that, a young man died under circumstances that remain sufficiently unresolved, that his family's independent autopsy reported that the cause was undetermined. That's the facts. What we cannot responsibly say from the evidence presented currently, right, is what actually happened. We can imbibe some of the history, but that doesn't necessarily tell us exactly how Nolan died. But history can tell us why people are asking what they're asking. The evidence must tell us what happened, though. And now let's test the same principle against a case that is developing in the same time as we close out on this episode. Tasia Fortune was a 29-year-old. Her body was discovered on August 3rd behind a vacant home in Jackson, Mississippi, hanging from a tree. Authorities said that the body may have been there for several days. As of the latest reporting that is available before this episode, the investigation remained active and an official autopsy is being expected to determine cause and manner of death. Authorities have not publicly established whether the death resulted from homicide or suicide. But imagine hearing only this: Black woman, Mississippi, hanging from a tree. What does history immediately put in our mind? Lynching. And that reaction does not come from nowhere. Even tonight, I phrase it in a way that is being reported. Mississippi has an extensively documented history of racial lynching, one of the largest. But does the historical existence of lynching establish that Tasia Fortune was lynched? No, not by the current evidence. Does the physical trait that she was found hanging establish homicide? No, could have been suicide. Would calling a death a suicide before the medical and investigative evidence established it be responsible? No. So what should history do? History should increase the quality of our questions. It should make us ask the questions of Mississippi. Was there evidence of another person's involvement? What does the autopsy establish? Was there any racial incidents that were involved with her before? Were there any racial incidents that were going on in her area? What injuries were present on her body? Were there witnesses? What does the digital evidence suggest with her cell phone or where she was last? Those are things that we can investigate. But the moment we take unanswered questions and convert them into answers, we have crossed the line we have spent this evening talking about. I want you to understand that we can look at the history and we can validate the history, but that doesn't make us jump ahead. And that is where the detail that we're raising tonight is important. Because if a person connected to Fortune was interviewed, and if that person was arrested for an unrelated firearm offense, we have to keep those propositions separate unless evidence connects them. And arrest on an unrelated charge establishes something about that charge, but not her death. It does not automatically establish the causation of Fortune's death. There can be correlation, but that doesn't mean causation. The word unrelated has evidentiary meaning, but a lot of us are missing that. Could investigators later discover a connection? Absolutely. Could the firearm become relevant? Yeah, baby. Could the person interviewed eventually become a suspect? All of that could happen. But until evidence reduces those possibilities, certainly would be something we added to the case. And that is what I'm trying to tell you. Stop establishing causality. Stop saying because this happened, that happened. Understand the difference and the function of correlation. We have spent generations objecting when Black people were treated as guilty through proximity, accusation, association, arrests, racial stereotypes, public, the way the public sees us, public suspicion. If we oppose that on principle, we cannot reproduce it merely because the person currently under suspicion fits a narrative we find plausible. And I've seen people post today, oh, they found someone, but not looking at those propositions as separate. That does not mean becoming naive. It means becoming disciplined. It means carrying the facts. There are major differences between suspicion and inference. A suspicion is the reason why we want to investigate something. And inference is a conclusion that we put in, drawn, as I told you earlier, from circumstance or evidence that may not even be factual. And a causal chain requires something more than a pile of disturbing facts. If we learn that one person argued with another person, or that person was near the other person, and that the first person owned a weapon, or that the first person lied about something, or that the first person had a criminal record, those facts are substantial to increase our desire and suspicion, but it does not give us the right to infer cause. And this is where another thing I want you to look this up. A concept called Bayesian reasoning can help without turning tonight into a mathematical problem. Bayesian reasoning is simply a way of updating what we believe as new evidence arrives. It is how we adjust. It is how we adjust. We begin with what appears plausible, receive new information, and we adjust our confidence values accordingly. And that key word is adjust. We don't declare. We don't say this is. We say we adjust. If evidence strongly supports something, we adjust. If forensic evidence, we adjust. And this may sound obvious, but we don't do it. Because these cases do not arrive at neutral puzzles. They arrive carrying all of the biases that we talked about. Historical memory can bias us. A community remembers Emmett Till. A community remembers Ida B. Wells's Red Record and things that she discovered. A community remembers people being killed before trial. A community remembers racial violence in Mississippi. We remember all of those things. But memory can become dangerous when an analogy replaces evidence. When an analogy is when meaningful similarities between two situations, right? It can help us recognize possibilities. It cannot establish that every characteristic of the earlier situation exists in the last one. But we play these games. Mississippi plus black victim plus hanging creates a historical, meaningful analogy. It does not produce a forensic conclusion. Young black men plus white friends plus unexpected death creates questions informed by racial history, but it does not establish murder. Police skepticism can be historically justified. It does not establish police deception. And that distinction may be one of the most important forms of intellectual self-discipline that Black people as a community, we have to learn and practice, because misinformation does not become harmless when it supports us. A false accusation against somebody we distrust is still a false accusation. And white people, you need to understand, historically, this is something that has been done by a large part of our population. And if we surrender our evidentiary standards to this, whenever it fits our bias, we're going to have a problem. We're going to have a problem. Tonight, we established that these mechanisms are real. We established that accusations can become social conclusions before adjudication. We established a lot tonight. And I thank all of you who go through and watch this, because I think it's important that we do this, that we learn these things. I'm going to put my wife's book that she wrote in here, because I believe a lot of some of the things that we talked about tonight equate to her book also. Not just to my equation that I gave you earlier for my analysis, but also her analysis. And because we try to give you this stuff so you can see it in its deeper accessory, so that you're not just going off of some generalized history or understanding. Tonight, if you take nothing else, historical mistrust can influence how people interpret uncertainty. But rather, the mechanism is on current cases like Nolan, Wells, Tasia Fortune, or any other. The fact is, we have to be disciplined. And if we cannot tolerate, right, that discipline, then we have a problem. We have a problem. Because if we cannot tolerate that uncertainty, then we haven't learned history. We haven't learned the real lessons of it. Because perhaps the most important thing that I get from Ida B. Wells asking America to do what she did was not automatically to believe Black people. It was something a little bit more demanding. Check your claims, or in the words of today, check your receipts. And now you have to understand why that's so important and how it raises those questions. What would happen if we applied that standard consistently, even when the evidence leads somewhere we did not expect? As an analyst, I tell my sons, I always start off with the idea that I could be wrong. That's the best way to go. And then you grow it from there. So after everything we've examined tonight, I want to leave you with that question. What would it do? What would it take? What would it do to change your mind? Because if the answer is nothing, then we're no longer examining evidence. You already reached a verdict. Black history gives us every reason to understand why mistrust exists. Ida B. Wells showed us why it exists. But understanding that history should make us better investigators, better analysts of the present, not prisoners of expectations about it. Because let me tell you something. All of these Black people who are dying, Nolan, Xavier Wells, Tasia Fortune, and so many others, they deserve evidence rather than assumption. Families deserve answers rather than speculation. Families deserve to be treated with respect other than pundits and people getting on here making conclusions based off of no facts. The Black people deserve something deeper than narrative designed to tell us what we already believe. That's really what the Erudition Network is about. We don't study Black history simply to collect facts about the past. We study it because history gives us tools for understanding the systems operating around us right now that we've inherited from the past. And if that's the kind of Black history you're looking for, I tell you, subscribe to the Erudition Network and watch another episode. Go back and watch some of our old ones when this live ends. You have a lot of deep dives here, and every episode you watch helps this independent, educational, factual, historical platform continue doing the work. And if in this time it was difficult to fit in your schedule, I've got you covered. I put shorts out. I put all of these shorts out during the week. We cut those larger investigations to faster pieces that you can watch and you can go and then can pique your interest before you get to watching the full episode. And if one catches your attention, share it. Share it, put it out there. Understand the context because context matters. But share the episodes. Help us to grow. Send it to somebody you agree with, somebody you disagree with. Send it to people. Ask them the questions we asked tonight. What does the evidence actually establish? And if you want to take this kind of thinking beyond that screen, I told you I'm going to give you my wife's book in the chat tonight on our YouTube page. And you can also go get my book on early world history, the Erudition Network, 101 Black History Question Challenge. And I guarantee you're going to grow from both of those books. Don't let those books just sit out there in the ether space to not be explored. If you are interested in what we talked about tonight, if it piques your scientific mind, your academic mind, your curiosity, go get those books. I'm Eddie K. Phillips. I'm a strategic public historian, and it's the Erudition Network. I appreciate your time tonight. Keep questioning, keep checking, keep growing. Go look for the sources in the books that I'm going to put in here tonight that I always do for you all to go back and check all of our sources. And when somebody tells you what happened before the evidence gets there, remember the question we started with tonight. How did alleged become guilty? How did you come to the conclusion before ever asking the question? All right, I'm going to get out of here. You all be blessed. God willing, we will be with you again next week. Thank you for your time, and we'll see you soon.
From Eddie K. Phillips, founder of the Erudition Network, comes 101 Black History Questions, a groundbreaking book that challenges what you thought you knew and uncovers the stories history tried to hide. Perfect for classrooms, families, and curious minds. Get the digital copy today on Amazon.